History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to History Goes Bump Redux. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this Redux, we're rewinding back to a very, an awful location, honestly. It's probably one of the worst things in the history of America, Andersonville Prison. Lots of bad stuff happened here.
Indeed.
You ready to go back?
I'm ready. During February 1864, Camp Sumter was opened in Macon County, Georgia. Camp Sumter came to be known as Andersonville, and that is what it is still referred to as today. Of all the prisons we've featured on the podcast, Andersonville Prison might just be the worst. This prison was opened to house Union prisoners during the Civil War, and to say that it was overcrowded would be an understatement. The amount of prisoners who lost their lives at this prison reaches into the several thousands. And the prison was not open for very long. These kinds of conditions and numbers of death usually lead to paranormal activity, and there seems to be quite a bit of it going on here. Join us as we explore the history and hauntings of Andersonville Prison.
From the beginning of the Civil War until 1862, prisoners were exchanged on the battlefield. A private for a private, a sergeant for a sergeant, and a captain for a captain. Problems arose with this system in 1862, resulting in the creation of large holding pens for prisoners on both sides. Union Army Major General John A. Dix and Confederate Major General Daniel H. Hill met on July 18, 1862, and drafted a cartel providing for the parole and exchange of prisoners. The draft was submitted to and approved by their superiors. The Dix-Hill Cartel, as it became known, was signed and ratified 4 days later. The cartel failed before the end of the year for various reasons, including the Confederate government's refusal to exchange or parole black prisoners. They threatened to treat black prisoners like slaves and execute their white officers. Prisoners were returned to the battlefield too soon, creating another problem. Confederate prisoners from Vicksburg's surrender on July 4th were paroled and back on the battlefield within weeks. Kind of like you're giving back the prisoners only to have them turn around and fight you some more.
On October 23, 1862, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton directed that all commanders of prison camps be informed that exchanges of prisoners would cease, greatly affecting the large number of prisoners held in northern and southern prison camps. Northern prisoner of war camps were Camp Douglas in Chicago and Johnson's Island and Camp Chase in Ohio. Southern prisoner of war camps were Libby Prison and Bell Island in Richmond and Camp Florence in South Carolina. The two prisons in Richmond were overcrowded by mid-1863. The overcrowding and severe food shortages caused Confederate officials to look for a suitable location far south of Richmond. They selected Captain W. Sidney Winder to find a suitable location in southwest Georgia.
In Milledgeville, Georgia's capital, Governor Joseph E. Brown introduced Winder to legislators for southwestern counties in Georgia. Winder then traveled to Albany, but property owners discouraged him, so then he traveled to Americus, where Uriah Harold, a commissary department purchasing agent, told him about Andersonville, which he claimed had a large supply of good, clear water. Andersonville was 5 miles west of the Flint River and 1,600 feet east of the Southwestern Railroad's Andersonville Depot in Sumter County, now part of Macon County. Winder evaluated the area and selected it in mid-December 1863. Construction of the prison was the responsibility of the Quartermaster Department, who chose Richard B. Winder of Maryland to oversee the project. Were they related to each other, I wonder?
In January 1864, slaves started digging a ditch and felling trees to construct the prison that would house 10,000 prisoners. Pine trees were cut 22 feet in length with 5 feet set in the ground and 17 feet above ground. Broad axes were used to make all sides of the wood flat so prisoners could not see outside of the prison. The stockade had 2 gates, one on the south and one on the north, and 80 sentry boxes at 40-yard intervals. The prison's interior had a deadline about 19 feet from the stockade wall. Guards were given orders to shoot prisoners who crossed the deadline. The prison was completed in the 3rd week of March. I wonder if that's where the word deadline originated from.
I don't know. That's a good question.
You want to go down a rabbit hole?
Hello?
Hello?
We're down here in the rabbit hole.
And we've brought you with us.
So let me go over to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it has here, we all have deadlines in life, and most of us are not happy about them. Some of us deal with this by taking to the internet and reading articles on diverting things such as word histories. We do this in an effort to feel as though we are actually engaged in something useful rather than simply procrastinating. Actually, I do it just because I'm very curious. If you are reading this because you feel pressured by some deadline that is hanging over your head, you can relax a bit, since no one's going to kill you for missing it. Although that has not always been the case. People did used to be killed for crossing a deadline. And it actually has a picture here that says Burial Detail at Andersonville, a Confederate prison for Union soldiers, August 1864. In the 1860s, a deadline was a line within or around a prison. Prisoners would be shot for crossing the deadline. Some of the earliest mentions of deadline come up in 1863, preserved in diaries kept by captive soldiers during the Civil War. Robert Ransom wrote in his diary, "Before noon we were turned into the pen, which is merely enclosed by a ditch and the dirt taken from the ditch thrown up on the outside, making a sort of breastwork. The ditch serves as a deadline, and no prisoners must go near the ditch." So, yes, indeed, that is where deadline comes from, Kelly. Now, how are we going to get out of this rabbit hole?
I see some extra planks, you know, the ones that are shaved off so they're flat on one side. Hey, Mort!
Yes, my dear.
Can you drag that over here so we can, I don't know, climb up it?
Well, this is an old historic site, and I don't think I should be touching these artifacts.
Mort, the wood that is left over from the prison building is not an artifact. Please send it down.
Okay.
Ugh, it's tough to get good help around here.
No kidding. The first 500 prisoners arrived at Andersonville Prison Camp, also referred to as Camp Sumter, February 25th, and put into the unfinished stockade, which had a shortage of equipment and food. Before authorities could get the prison put in order, they were swamped by the unceasing arrival of prisoners, which numbered about 400 every day.
Oh, my word.
There was short supply of food and containers to hold rations, such as plates and cups. Prisoners resorted to using hats or sleeves torn from clothing and tied with string to hold their rations. During March, rations consisted of cornmeal, beans, and occasionally meat. As prisoners continued arriving, food rations diminished. Prisoners were divided into detachments of 270 men and then subdivided into 3 companies of 90 men each, with a sergeant in charge. The sergeants received the rations and divided them as equally as possible amongst the men. By the end of March, there was only cornmeal and a little salt. And I can only imagine if you mix the cornmeal with water and salt, you're just going to get that concrete, basically, in the gut.
On March 27, 1864, Captain Henry Wurz was placed in charge of the prison. Wurz, who was born in Zurich, Switzerland in 1823, received some medical training before his father insisted he enter the mercantile field. Wurz came to America in 1849. He joined the 4th Louisiana Infantry at the beginning of the Civil War and was wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines. Wurz was described as scrawny and gimpy-armed. By April 1, 1864, the stockade, designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, held 7,160. By May 8, 5,787 more prisoners arrived. 728 prisoners died, 13 escaped, and 7 were recaptured, for a total of 12,213 prisoners in the stockade. Richard Winder made the terrible mistake in locating the prison's bakery and cookhouse upstream from the prison, which polluted the stream used by the prisoners for drinking and bathing.
Death was caused by contagious diseases, polluted drinking water inside the stockade, inadequate hospital accommodations, lack of prisoners' quarters, exposure to the elements, bad sanitary practices, short and defective rations, and overcrowding. In order to protect themselves from the elements, prisoners constructed what they called shebangs. Shebangs. Just lent itself to that one, didn't it? The huts and lean-tos were made from logs, limb shrubs, and brush left in the stockade, as well as blankets, tent flies, overcoats, and clothing from the dead. The Confederates and prisoners made no effort to properly design or lay out streets in the stockade's interior, so the shebangs went in all directions. The disorganization and lack of proper camp administration probably caused a higher death rate. Prisoners' letters, diaries, and manuscripts all contain the same subjects: the loneliness, dejection, hopelessness, helplessness, and complete despair.
Lumber and tools ordered to erect barracks and other facilities for the prisoners were used for buildings outside the prison. Not receiving the lumber not only prevented shelters from being erected, it also affected sanitation in the prison. Captain Wirz came up with a good idea to solve the sewage and toilet problem. He planned to build 2 dams across a stream running through the stockade and flush out of the bottom end of the stream daily by opening the dams. If lumber and tools had been available, his idea could have worked. 2 squads of 25 prisoners each were supplied with shovels every day and charged with removing all offal from the prison. The combustible part was burned and the rest thrown into the stream.
In May 1864, 708 prisoners died. The prison contained 12,000 prisoners, as we said, with at least 500 arriving each day. So now we're just piling more on top. The stream was a quagmire. One prisoner wrote, "All of the filth from the prison ran into the creek, and we had to strain the water through our teeth to keep the maggots out."
Oh my God.
The excessive heat enhanced many types of diseases. There was little chance of escape with 1,200 guards, 4 pieces of artillery, and a cavalry company. Men lacking shelter from the weather developed sores, which in time often turned into gangrene. Disease and sores were spread through lice, and thousands of flies swarmed throughout the prison. Killing lice became a game that helped pass the time. The excessive summer heat caused many types of diseases, such as typhus, smallpox, dysentery, and diarrhea to spread through the prison. That summer, more than 100 prisoners died each day. During the winter, many prisoners died from the cold. This is a death camp for sure.
Authorities were advised to move the hospital outside the prison and supply enough tents for 1,000 patients. When a new hospital was located outside the prison stockade, it only had tents for 800. And by June 1864, there were 1,035 in the hospital and 3,000 sick inside the stockade. Many prisoners were insane, helpless, and entirely naked. One prisoner later wrote, "The sight of all the misery, the starved, dying, and half-naked humans all around, those with scurvy, misshaped limbs, swollen joints, and festering sores infected with gangrene, all contributed to make the newcomer so unnerved that he would soon get into a mental condition of despair, out of which the ghost beacon of death seemed welcome. By the end of summer, the crowding was worse and spread of disease increased."
When a prisoner became helpless, gang members called raiders would rob him. Over time, the raiders' boldness grew, and the robbery victim was sometimes murdered. At the end of June 1864, with the help of Captain Wirz, the raiders were identified and removed from the prison for trial. From the opening of the prison up until they were caught, the raiders had robbed, murdered, and in every way made life even more horrible for the prisoners. A trial was held at the end of June 1864. Some of the guilty raiders were ordered to wear a ball and chain. Some were strung up by their thumbs or set in stocks. 6 of the leaders were found guilty of murder and were hanged on July 11, 1864. A police force called the Regulators was organized within the prison and headed by Limber Jim. Was he good at stretching?
Each day, prisoners received a quarter of a loaf of bread weighing about 6 ounces and 4 or 5 ounces of pork. After rations were dispersed, prisoners tried to trade for something more palatable or for things they needed, such as trading salt for wood or trading wood for beans. Food was constantly on the minds of all the prisoners. They thought about it while awake and dreamt about it at night. Before the end of summer, prisoners were being served mush for breakfast, mush for dinner, and mush with no salt for supper. As rations decreased, many days prisoners received only a pint of boiled rice with no meat or bread to go with it.
Prisoners took up professions such as bakers, bucket makers, launderer, and kettle makers to kill time, as well as make money for their needs. Most raw materials were smuggled in since the Confederate guards liked receiving Yankee greenbacks. Prisoners were allowed to receive boxes of food from outside after being carefully inspected, and they were allowed to send and receive mail subject to the post commander's approval. If a box arrived for a prisoner who had died, it was given to the hospital authorities for distribution.
Prisoners constantly talked of escaping, and many attempts were made, such as attempts to tunnel out and running away while outside the stockade on detail. One prisoner pretended to be dead and had two friends carry him out to the dead house. After dark, he got up and ran away. Captain Wirz, suspecting the trick, had a surgeon inspect all dead bodies before releasing them for burial. By the end of summer, many tunnels had been dug and some prisoners were able to escape. Tunnels were found 14 feet deep and from 90 to 100 feet long.
I was thinking if they were going to tunnel out, they would have had to dig really deep because those logs that they put in there were at least 5 feet into the ground.
Right. Prisoners hoping for a morsel of food would report escape plans to authorities, leading to the capture of men.
Prison life took on a routine except for tricks played on guards. When a prisoner died, fellow prisoners in his detachment tried to hide the fact he was dead as long as possible so they could receive his rations. To hide the death from the guards, the sergeant would count many live prisoners 2 or 3 times. Also, when a prisoner died, his friend would tie one end of a strong piece of cord around the corpse and the other end around himself to prevent the body from being stolen during the night. Carrying his dead friend to the dead house enabled him to pick up a piece of wood the next day for cooking his food.
Oh, wow.
So you'd almost be relieved if your buddy died. Oh, good, I can get some wood.
On May 21, 1864, the Sumter Republican reported, "The Andersonville prisoners nearly escaped. The commander discovered the plans. At this time, there are 17,000 prisoners there, and 500 are being added every day.
I mean, that's almost twice as much as what it was meant for at this point.
They cannot be turned loose upon the people. 3,000 to 5,000 men are needed to keep them, but there are only 500 men there. Colonel Persons is aware of the problem. West Georgia is the Egypt of the Confederacy, and the crops must not be destroyed." By June 17th, there were 21,539 prisoners at Andersonville. By the end of June, there were 25,000 prisoners, and 7,968 men had been admitted into the hospital.
So now you've had almost 4,000 people added in a couple of weeks, and, another almost 8,000 that are in the hospital there. There's no way that they could possibly take care of all these people. Many of the prisoners who arrived at Andersonville in April and May had an abundance of money. The Union armies were reclothed and paid off in spring 1864 for the spring campaigns. Many of the new recruits and re-enlisted veterans had bounty money with them when captured. Prisoners concealed money on their person in many ways. Greenbacks could be pressed inside a brass button, pressed into the sole of a shoe, or put into the bowls of large Dutch pipes with a little tobacco sprinkled. Some prisoners swallowed their rings. Gambling was rampant. Faro, dice, and 10 stakes were commonly played for. Trade was carried on with guards outside of the wall by talking through cracks and throwing articles over the fence. Captain Wirz allowed sutlers inside the prison walls to sell items to the prisoners. Prisoners with money could buy the necessities of life, such as peas, pones, wheat, flour, and salt, which were very expensive and rapidly ate up the prisoners' money. Luxury items such as tobacco, onions, eggs, soda, red pepper, gingerbread, soap, taffy, sour beer, apples, and peaches were also available to those with money. Besides money, various items like gold and silver watches and rings, pocket knives and mugs, and laurel pipe bowls carved from wood were also exchanged for food.
On July 1st, 1864, an addition to the prison was completed, adding another 10 acres to the stockade, which was now 26.5 acres. There were 26,367 prisoners in the compound. As prisoners were moved into the newly completed addition, there was a stampede, and many prisoners were hurt pressing through the 12-foot opening. The sick falling down in the press were trampled and killed. Strong men became wedged between the moving mass and standing timbers. A large number of strong and weak prisoners were severely injured and never recovered, and an unknown number of prisoners died. By July 21st, there were 29,201 prisoners in the stockade and 1,735 in the hospital. On August 4th, prisoners signed a petition which was circulated through the stockade. It requested the speedy release of all prisoners from the horrible conditions they were living in. It was brought to the proper authorities in Washington, D.C., but nothing was done.
And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors.
There were many church meetings among the prisoners, with various clergy to priests and other Christian prisoners doing the ministering. During July, Andersonville officials became very concerned. General William T. Sherman's army was near Atlanta, and prison officials were worried that prisoners fueled by reports from new prisoners would start a mass uprising. Slaves from surrounding farms were brought in to fell trees and dig additional earthworks in anticipation of a cavalry attack. General Sherman did order 2 cavalry units to ride south and cut the Macon Railroad. He also told General George Stoneman, who was the commander on the units, to advance on Macon itself. General Stoneman planned to free Union officers at Camp Oglethorpe in Macon and then head south to free the 29,000 prisoners at Andersonville. He had 2,500 men and a 2-gun battery. He left Atlanta on July 27th at 3 a.m. and headed south, followed by 4,000 Confederate cavalrymen.
He was attacked by the Georgia militia, and in a number of skirmishes, his cavalry was defeated. Union soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner, resulting in 500 more prisoners in Andersonville.
So much for freeing all the guys there.
In August, 2,933 prisoners died. 1,305 were sick in the hospital, and 5,100 were sick in the stockade. During August, the number of prisoners in the stockade was 32,899.
Oh my gosh.
Prison conditions were horrendous. Prisoners were dying at a rate of 100 per day. By August 4th, there were 33,000 prisoners in the stockade, including 2,208 in the hospital. Holes were dug not only for escape attempts, but also to collect water and for warmth from the northern cold. Many holes caved in and suffocated prisoners. The water holes dried up from heat during July and August, so many prisoners died in August. Gravediggers were being kept busy, and listing the names of the dead became a 24-hour job.
6 months after opening Andersonville, the authorities finally showed some organization by instituting the rules of Andersonville Prison.
Oh, okay.
Only took them 6 months. In September, and I mean, this place is just burgeoning and just filling up so quickly. In September, the framework for 4 barracks, housing 270 prisoners each, was completed. As the men started moving into the barracks, 2 more barracks neared completion. During September, 2,677 prisoners died, or 23.3% of those confined in Andersonville. Between February, when the prison opened, and September 21st, 9,479 prisoners had died. So almost 9,500 prisoners had died in a very short period of time there. Diarrhea had killed 3,530 and dysentery killed 999. But there's always room for one more.
Oh, Diane.
For a total of 58.7% of the deaths during the first 6 months of Andersonville's existence. So over half the people coming in there were dying.
And that number, 9,000 plus, was near the 10,000 it was only supposed to originally contain.
Good point. So basically they had almost the entire contents of the prison die at least once.
Starting in September, some of the healthier prisoners were moved in detachments from Andersonville to Camp Lawton at Millen, Georgia, and to Florence, South Carolina, to help relieve the overcrowded conditions and due to the movement of General Sherman's army near Atlanta. By September 8th, 5,000 prisoners had been moved. By the end of September, the stockade that had held over 30,000 prisoners a few weeks earlier was nearly empty. The only prisoners remaining were those who could not walk and those who had to work on the outside of the prison to keep it operating. By October, Andersonville no longer received prisoners, and only those unable to travel remained. It became a prison hospital housing a high proportion of sick prisoners. Besides the 8,218 prisoners there on October 1st, another 444 were added during the month. Of those 8,662 men, 3,913 received treatment in the hospital, and 1,560 of those died. 28 escaped, and 2,811 were transferred to other prisons.
At the beginning of December, 2,000 prisoners arrived from Salisbury, North Carolina. On December 22, 1864, General Cooper, Inspector General of the Confederacy, wrote General John Winder, that Savannah had been evacuated and suggested that prisoners from Columbia, Salisbury, and Florence be moved immediately to Andersonville because there was only one road open from Branchville to Augusta. Prisoners once again started arriving daily at Andersonville. At the beginning of January, 197 prisoners died. During January, 4,000 to 5,000 prisoners arrived daily from other prison camps. They finally got the place emptied out. Now they're going to fill it up again. Winter 1864 to 1865 was the coldest winter in 25 years in southwest Georgia. One night, the temperature was 18 degrees above zero. The prisoners had little clothing, and wood they attempted to burn for warmth was too wet. More prisoners arrived at the end of January. February was more pleasant, and the prisoners knew that if Sherman had been defeated, there would have been a larger influx of prisoners, but the only prisoners arriving were from other prisons.
As the weather warmed, the prisoners started exercising and began singing patriotic songs. For the first time in 12 months, the prisoners were optimistic. Rumors were good rumors. Exchange, the end of the war, going home. In March, 180 prisoners in Andersonville Hospital died. From the guards, prisoners learned the Yankees captured Selma, Alabama, and would arrive soon. The few prisoners that arrived brought good news. On March 25th, 800 prisoners left, and there was talk that a train would leave every day full of prisoners. On March 28th, new prisoners brought word that General Wilson's cavalry was on the way. In April, the war ended.
During the last full month of Andersonville's existence, 28 prisoners died. Most of the prisoners were sent to Vicksburg for exchange. Slowly, the prisoners left Andersonville. When Union forces arrived at Andersonville in May, about 3 weeks after the war ended, only a small number of prisoners remained. Before arrangements could be made to transport the sick and frail soldiers home, one more prisoner died. During Andersonville's 14-month existence, 12,914 prisoners died at the prison. Hundreds of the prisoners that left Andersonville perished on the way home when the Sultana, the steamboat they were on, exploded and sank near Memphis, Tennessee. Hundreds more died in northern hospitals or in hometowns from diseases they incurred while prisoners at Andersonville. The human misery reached its zenith at Andersonville. The tombstones in Andersonville National Cemetery and the things that prisoners wrote tell a very tragic story, and of course we shared some of that writing.
Dorrance Atwater and Clara Barton worked together after the closure of the prison to locate and identify prisoners who had died at Andersonville and inform their families. For prisoners who died at Camp Sumter, record-keeping was shabby at best. There was great concern that after the war, relatives would not be able to locate and identify the bodies of their loved ones. Into this situation stepped one prisoner, Dorrance Atwater, of the 2nd New York Cavalry. Sent to Andersonville, Atwater was detailed as a clerk to the surgeon, who recorded all the daily deaths. Secretly, Atwater compiled a duplicate list of names and regiments of the deceased, keying them to numbers that were inscribed on the hastily erected posts or boards that were placed above the graves. With the war over, Atwater eventually saw this list of 12,912 names published, thereby enabling proper identification of the graves. He received no reward for his efforts, but Dorrance Atwater was a true hero of the Civil War.
Clara Barton was known as the Angel of the Battlefield, and she was a very famous nurse during the war. She started receiving letters from family members trying to locate loved ones who did not return home. In an effort to help the families, she started the painstaking research of trying to find the missing soldiers and respond to the families' inquiries. Dorrance Atwater contacted Barton in June 1865, requesting copies of her list of missing soldiers. Elated, Barton contacted Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, requesting permission to accompany the U.S. Army's expedition to identify graves at Andersonville. While at Andersonville in July and August 1865, Atwater and Barton read the letters she had received from relatives of missing soldiers and searched through the Andersonville Death Register and captured hospital records looking for the missing soldiers. Laborers placed headboards over the dead soldiers' graves in the cemetery. Barton wrote dozens of letters letting family members know that their loved ones had died at Andersonville. When the expedition was finished, Barton was given the honor of raising an American flag, for the first time, over the newly established Andersonville National Cemetery.
After leaving Andersonville in 1865, Barton set up the Missing Soldiers Office in Washington, D.C. She had hired numerous clerks, including Dorrance Atwater, to answer the more than 60,000 letters she received. By 1867, when the missing soldiers' office closed, Barton and her staff had identified more than 20,000 missing soldiers, including the prisoners who died at Andersonville Prison. Due to her fame as a nurse, Barton received the majority of the credit for the work of the Andersonville Expedition and Missing Soldiers' Office. While touring the nation, lecturing on the suffering of Andersonville's prisoners, and displaying artifacts she had collected at the prison, Barton was hailed as Heroine of Andersonville. The Andersonville Survivors Association inducted her as an honorary member, and the Andersonville Expedition to identify graves became known as Barton's Expedition.
With all of this pain and death, it's not surprising that Andersonville Prison has stories about supernatural experiences there. People claim to feel the sadness and extreme fear that clings to the area as if whomever's still here in the afterlife is continuing to feel torment and despair. Many of the experiences are sensory, both audible and olfactory. People claim of a foul stench coming from the grounds, particularly the cemetery. Sounds range from gunshots to loud cries, whimpers, and whispers from the formerly alive prisoners. Marching has also been heard. EVPs have been collected over the years featuring these cries and distant gunshots. Full-bodied apparitions have been seen walking in the fog that sometimes coats the grounds. They appear as shadows moving in the mist that never seem to truly emerge. Many believe that the raiders who were hanged here for their crimes against their fellows are angry and still walk about the camp as though they still wield some kind of power here.
The spirit of Father Wieland is believed to be here, still taking care of and comforting the disembodied, just as he did when they were still alive. And it should come as no surprise that Captain Wirz is still on the grounds. He was the only Confederate to be executed for war crimes. Captain Wirz's ghost has been seen multiple times, usually walking along the road leading into the prison. He often looks angry when seen pacing back and forth in the stockade.
It's not surprising because he was in charge of everything here, but I would imagine one of the reasons why his spirit would come back is because he was put to death for war crimes, which definitely this looks like war crimes, running this prison where you're basically starving people and they're all so sick and everything. But he did try to defend himself, saying, well, I was only working with what I had. So
right.
It does make you kind of wonder if he wasn't just a scapegoat too. Although he was in charge, it would be kind of hard when you're being inundated with all of these prisoners and all these sick people trying to take care of everything. This is a story from Nancy Roberts, who wrote Civil War Ghost Stories and Legends. One Saturday in July 1990, Curry McClellan and Bill Blue headed down Highway 75 out of Atlanta and took the Highway 49 exit leading to Andersonville, 9 miles northeast of Americas. Bill was a native Southerner. Curry, a Vietnam veteran and displaced Northerner upon moving to Atlanta, had developed an intense interest in the Civil War. Trips like this one had formed strong bonds of friendship between the two men despite their differing sympathies. I've heard that the ghost of Captain Wirz has been seen walking along this road, said Bill, as Curry sped toward the Andersonville historic site in his silver Dodge Caravan. Curry didn't reply. Did you hear me? I'm not into superstition, Bill. I'm here to learn as many facts as I can about what this place was like 125 years ago. How it was for the men who lived here. Yeah, I know what you mean. I wasn't serious. They stopped in Andersonville to get a Coke at a filling station, then passed the railroad depot, where incoming northern prisoners detrained from the Southwestern Railroad, now central of Georgia, to march the quarter-mile to the prison park. Well, we're here, exclaimed Curry. He found himself giving a slight shiver. Hard to realize thousands of Union prisoners died at this place. About 13,000, I think. My great-great-grandfather Curry was here. His stories came down in the family. Prisoners got something like a half pint of broth with a few cowpeas in it, a little meat, and moldy cornbread. Bill was irritated. What do you think the Confederate soldiers were eating? Fried chicken, salad greens, and biscuits? I think these fellows were lucky if they still had their boots and blankets when they got here. They were captured by Confederates who had nothing themselves. We're going to have to decide on a campsite soon. You realize the sun's about to set. Let's decide where to camp, Bill suggested. Why not go into the village, get something to eat, and then come back and park just outside the gates? Think they'd let us do that? Bill answered, far as I know. 2 hours later, they had eaten country ham and fried chicken at the historic Old Windsor Hotel, stopped at a store to buy some milk and cereal for breakfast, and returned. They parked about 100 feet from the cemetery gate. They looked around and found the raiders' grave markers. Willie Collins, the ringleader, dubbed himself Colonel Mosby after the Confederate guerrilla raider. Curry spat on Collins' grave. Hell's fire's too good for them. Bill was shocked at his outburst, but said only, "They sure didn't deserve to rest in peace, did they?" They both fell asleep in the van. Not long after midnight, Curry awoke and discovered what may have been the reason for feeling restless: an unusual, pungent odor. He looked at the sleeping man beside him and was instantly ashamed of his thought. It couldn't be Bill.
Oh my, what did you eat?
Dude, come on.
After that fried food?
Too much southern cooking. The smell became more odious by the minute. It smelled like human excrement. Was the odor stronger outside? He slid the van door back and went outside. The stench overwhelmed him, so it's almost like he's standing in raw sewage. Perspiration born of fear broke out on him. In China, he had been told that odor sometimes signified the presence of an evil spirit. Ridiculous. There was something familiar about this experience, however. He managed to place it. Vietnam, like the conditions of a military hospital. Odors of gangrene, running sores, putrescent wounds. He could hear the hoarse rasps of men's voices. He thought he'd better wake Bill up, but to his surprise, when he got back to the van, Bill was awake, and the terrible odor had woken him too. So it smells so bad, it woke them up. Bill laughed a bit uneasily. "We shouldn't have camped near a graveyard. Do you hear that noise? What in the hell is that? Like the murmur of a crowd getting bigger. I'm getting my shotgun." They could see mist all around them, and they could hear distant murmuring of, "Hang them, hang them, hang them." Eventually the sound faded. Both men were horribly shaken, and they were not ready to talk about the sounds they heard. The odor was still there, but was fading. There was a puddle on the ground, and they smelled the water, and it was horrible. The next morning, they asked the park personnel, who seemed puzzled. They said that kids around there believe that Wurs walks the roads in that area. Something was going on there. I think they were getting... What's weird is you could say that it was residual, hearing the chanting, like they're getting ready to hang the raiders or something. But the scent?
Yeah, I don't know.
Can a scent be residual? I've often wondered that.
My tummy's tossing and turning just listening to that paragraph.
I'd be like, let's just get out of here. It stinks so bad. And then there's Ghosts and Haunts of the Civil War, written by Christopher Coleman. The story he shares in here took place in December of 1971, so I was about 2 months old.
Gucci, Gucci, goo.
3 people were returning home one night from a civic club meeting in Americus, Georgia. As they passed by the road marker for Andersonville late at night, they saw a figure standing by the road. They had passed too quickly, though, to get a close look. He looked real enough, but was dressed in a most curious manner. He was dressed in military-style clothing. However, being midnight, they could not be certain of the color of the clothing. He wore a great coat and had what looked like a kepi on his head. No sooner had they passed by him than they turned the car around to get a closer look. So unusual did the man seem to them. But when they came back to the same spot, he was nowhere to be seen. It had not been more than a minute or two, and there was no place for anyone to hide near the road. Yet the man had vanished into thin air. In discussing the incident later, the trio all agreed that they had seen something out of the ordinary, perhaps supernatural. As they compared notes and discussed it with friends, they were convinced that the man's uniform was old and odd, more appropriate to the Civil War than anything of more recent vintage. And they remembered that the person, their uniform didn't look ragged and they didn't look emaciated, so they didn't think it was a prisoner, which led a lot of people to think that maybe it was Wurs. There was another visitor to the National Historic Site, and they encountered another of the camp's apparitions. This one was dressed neither in blue or gray, but in black. Even more strange, the man carried an umbrella. When the visitor reported what he had seen to a park interpreter, the man did not seem surprised. Officially, of course, there are no ghosts at Andersonville, but the staff have become familiar with sightings of Father Whelan making the rounds, so it's believed that this visitor had seen Father Whelan. Interesting. I wonder why he was carrying an umbrella. Was it to keep the sun off of himself or something?
Many men lost their lives here during a war that split this country and left so many devastated. Emotions of all kinds were high at this time, and so it's no wonder that something seems to be carrying over from the afterlife. Are these former prisoners still at the prison as ghosts? Is Andersonville Prison haunted?
That is for you to decide. Well, something's going on there. Sometime when we're going up to Georgia, we'll have to see. I'm not quite sure where the park is located. We'll have to check that out, especially the cemetery.
Yeah.
We love our cemeteries, especially
Absolutely.
national ones. So be interesting to check it out and see what it smells like.
Put it on the list.
He's like, we shouldn't have parked outside of a cemetery. It doesn't, cemeteries don't normally smell
No.
nowadays. So it shouldn't be that kind of a scent. Want to thank you guys for joining us on this Redux. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.